Black woman found a bleeding biker, holding twins. What happened next changed everyone's lives. A widowed black church pianist is driving home late at night when she stops under a dark overpass and finds a bleeding biker clutching two newborn babies to his chest. He claims the twins were born just hours earlier during a violent prison riot, something that shouldn't be possible. Before dawn, the biker dies, leaving her the babies and a town full of questions. As police investigate, strange things begin to happen. Hardened criminals confess. Broken marriages start to heal. Long-buried secrets rise to the surface. The twins seem to carry something no one can explain, forcing one woman to face a faith she thought she lost forever. Were these babies an accident or a miracle? And what happens when the truth finally comes out? Can this town survive it? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The soft glow of sanctuary lights washed over Isabel Brooks' hands as they moved across the familiar ivory keys. Sheet music for Amazing Grace sat before her, though she hadn't glanced at it once during the 2-hour choir rehearsal. After 35 years as Ridgeway Community Church's pianist, the hymns lived in her fingers like old friends. The last choir member's footsteps had faded 15 minutes ago, leaving Isabel alone in the vast wooden sanctuary. These quiet moments after practice had become her private ritual, a time to let the music speak what her heart couldn't quite voice. Tonight, her fingers wandered through gentle improvisation, the melodies rising up to the peaked ceiling like whispered prayers. The empty pews stretched before her, their polished wood catching glints of lamplight. 2 years ago, Charles would have been waiting in the back row, his patient smile visible even in the dimness. 5 years before that, their son Marcus would have been there too, probably checking his watch but trying not to look impatient. Now the silence pressed in around her like a heavy blanket, not altogether uncomfortable, but weighty with absence. Isabel's hands finally stilled on the keys. The last note hung in the air before dissolving into the familiar creaks and sighs of the old building. With practiced movements, she gathered her music into her worn leather bag and switched off the piano lamp. Her sensible shoes made soft sounds against the carpet as she walked down the center aisle, her shadow stretching long beside her. At the back of the sanctuary, she paused to look up at the cross mounted high on the wall. The smooth wood seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "I'm still here, Lord," she whispered, more out of habit than certainty. Some days that felt like enough. Other days, like tonight, the words carried a question she couldn't quite frame. The evening air hit her face as she stepped outside, heavy with the promise of rain. Isabel pulled her cardigan closer, hurrying to her 10-year-old Buick in the otherwise empty parking lot. The dashboard clock read 9:45 as she turned onto Route 19. The first drops of rain began to speckle her windshield, and she switched on the wipers to their lowest setting. The familiar drive home usually took 12 minutes exactly, past Miller's Grocery, the shuttered textile mill, 3 stoplights, and the railroad crossing. Isabel knew every pothole and turn by heart. But tonight, something made her grip the steering wheel a little tighter as she approached the overpass, where Route 19 crossed over Old Creek Road. Through the misty rain, her headlights caught something unusual, a large, dark shape huddled against one of the concrete supports. Initially, she did what she always did when something seemed out of place. She started to drive past. That's when she felt it. That gentle but insistent nudge in her spirit she recognized from other crossroads in her life. The same feeling she'd had the day she first sat down at a piano. The day she'd met Charles. The day she'd decided to keep playing at church even after the funerals. Her foot eased off the gas pedal before her mind fully registered the decision. The Buick slowed, tires crunching on the wet gravel of the shoulder. Isabel sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel, rain tapping a soft rhythm on the roof. "Lord, if this is you," she whispered, leaving the sentence unfinished. She reached into her glove compartment for the small flashlight she kept there, then carefully opened her door. The rain had picked up slightly, creating a fine mist that settled on her gray curls. Her shoes, practical flats, perfect for piano pedals but not for nighttime excursions, crunched against loose gravel as she took tentative steps toward the overpass. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself into a man. A large man, sitting with his back against the concrete, his broad shoulders hunched protectively over something he held against his chest. He didn't move as she approached, which sent a tremor of concern through her. "Sir?" she called softly, keeping a careful distance. "Are you all right?" The man's head lifted slightly, but Isabel couldn't make out his features in the darkness. What she did see made her breath catch. Wrapped in what looked like a jacket against his chest were two tiny forms. And then, cutting through the soft patter of rain and distant traffic, came a sound that reached straight into Isabel's heart, the unmistakable whimper of a newborn baby. The weak cry was followed by another, slightly different in pitch. Two babies. The reality of what she was seeing crashed over Isabel like a wave. Here was a man, clearly in distress, holding two newborn infants in the rain under an overpass at nearly 10 o'clock at night. She took another step forward, her flashlight beam steady now. "Sir, do you need help? Are the babies all right?" The man tried to speak, but could only manage a rough cough. When he shifted slightly, Isabel saw he was favoring his right side, and there was something wrong with the way he held his arm. He was injured, and here with two helpless infants, and the rain was getting heavier. Isabel Brooks had lived her life by the notes on the page, measured, predictable, careful. But standing there in the growing darkness, she felt the weight of this moment settling around her like a mantle. She thought of empty pews and quiet houses, of questions whispered in empty sanctuaries. She thought of all the times she'd driven past someone in need because it wasn't her business, wasn't her problem, wasn't her place to interfere. Another soft cry from one of the babies seemed to pierce straight through her careful walls. This was no random encounter. This was a divine appointment, and she knew with sudden clarity that everything, her solitary evenings at the piano, her familiar drives home, even her losses, had been preparing her for exactly this moment. She took a decisive step forward, then another, until she stood directly in front of the man. "I'm Isabel Brooks," she said firmly, her voice carrying the same steady authority she used to direct the choir. "And I'm going to help you. Can you stand?" The reality of what she was doing, approaching a stranger at night, offering help to someone who might be dangerous, hovered at the edges of her mind. But stronger than her fear was the certainty that she was exactly where she needed to be. The next steps weren't clear, but she knew without doubt that turning back was no longer an option. As if in confirmation, both babies began to cry in earnest now, their combined voices echoing under the overpass. The sound stirred something deep in Isabel's chest, not just maternal instinct, but a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. God had placed her here, at this moment, for these little ones and this injured man. Whatever came next would unfold note by note, like a new piece of music she would have to learn by heart. The rain fell steadily now, as Isabel knelt beside the massive figure, her knees pressing into the damp gravel. Up close, she could see the man was wearing motorcycle leathers, though they were torn and stained dark in places she suspected weren't just from rain. His breathing came in shallow gasps. "I'm Jordan," he managed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Jordan Mercer." He shifted slightly, and pain flickered across his face. "The babies. Need to make sure they're safe." Isabel leaned closer, directing her flashlight beam toward the two bundles cradled against his chest. The infants were impossibly tiny, still covered in traces of birth matter, their skin wrinkled and new. Their umbilical cords had been roughly tied off with what looked like shoelaces. "These babies," she said carefully. "They were just born?" Jordan nodded weakly. "Prison riot, at East Gate. Started this afternoon." He paused, struggling for breath. "Their mama. She didn't make it. I had to get them out." Isabel's mind struggled to make sense of his words. Eastgate Correctional was over 50 miles away. The evening news had mentioned nothing about a riot. And yet here were two newborns, clearly just hours old, and a badly injured man who seemed to be telling the truth, impossible as it seemed. "Sir, Mr. Mercer, you need medical attention. I'm going to call for help." She reached for her phone, but his large hand shot out with surprising strength, gripping her wrist. "Please," he rasped. "Can't let them go into the system. These little ones. They're special, important." His eyes, glazed with pain, fixed on hers with desperate intensity. "You have to protect them." Isabel glanced down at the infants. One let out a thin cry, tiny fingers flexing in the cold air. Something deep inside her chest cracked open, a space she'd sealed off years ago after losing first her husband, then her son. Without hesitation, she shrugged off her choir robe, the deep purple fabric still warm from the heated church. "Let me take them," she said softly. "You can barely hold them now." Jordan's arms trembled as he carefully transferred the babies to her. Isabel wrapped them securely in her robe, cradling them close to her body. They were so light, yet the weight of them in her arms felt somehow familiar, like returning to a piece of music she'd once known by heart. With shaking hands, she managed to dial 911 on her phone, wedging it between her ear and shoulder as she held the babies. "Yes, I'm under the Highway 19 overpass, just north of Ridgeway Community Church. There's an injured man here and—" She hesitated, looking at the infants. "And two newborn babies. We need immediate medical assistance." "Ma'am, stay where you are. Emergency services are on their way. Are the babies breathing?" Isabel checked them carefully. Despite everything, both infants were warm and taking regular breaths. "Yes, they're breathing. They seem stable, but they need to be checked by medical professionals." Jordan made a sound of distress. "Isabel." His voice was fainter now, but there was something in the way he said her name that made her freeze. "Isabel Brooks. God sent you. Knew you'd come." She stared at him, baffled. "How do you know my name?" But Jordan's eyes were closing, his head slumping forward. In the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder with each passing second. "Mr. Mercer? Jordan?" Isabel shifted the babies to one arm, reaching out to check his pulse with her free hand. It was there, but weak and thready. The sirens grew closer, and red and blue lights began to strobe against the concrete walls of the overpass. Isabel stood carefully, the babies secure in her arms, as two ambulances and 3 police cruisers pulled up, their tires crunching on wet gravel. Paramedics rushed toward them, their voices sharp and professional as they called out vital signs and medical terms. One team immediately began working on Jordan, while another approached Isabel with a thermal blanket and concerned expressions. "The babies," she said, even as they tried to lead her toward one of the ambulances. "They were just born. Today. during some kind of riot at Eastgate Prison. The paramedics exchanged glances but focused on checking the infant's vital signs. Isabel stood in the steady rain, watching as they loaded Jordan onto a stretcher. The babies were still in her arms. They hadn't taken them yet, though she knew they would. She looked down at their tiny faces, scrunched against the night air, and felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense of absolute certainty. These babies had been placed in her path for a reason. Jordan Mercer, whoever he was, had known her name. Had been waiting for her, perhaps. The how and why of it all was still a mystery, but standing there in the rain, holding two precious lives she'd never expected to carry, Isabel Brooks knew that her carefully ordered world had just shifted irreversibly on its axis. The paramedics were speaking to her now, asking her to come to the ambulance so they could properly examine the infants. Isabel moved forward automatically, her choir shoes squeaking on the wet pavement, the babies warm and real against her chest. Red and blue lights painted the rain in alternating colors, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled across the sky. Nothing about this night made sense, and yet somehow everything felt right, as if all the empty years had been leading her to this exact moment, under this overpass, with these two unexpected miracles in her arms. The fluorescent lights of Ridgeway General Hospital's emergency waiting area cast a harsh glow over Isabel's purple choir robe, now draped across her lap like a blanket. In her arms, the twins slept peacefully, their tiny faces serene despite the chaos that had brought them here. The clock on the wall read 10:45, its second hand ticking away with mechanical precision. A young nurse with kind eyes approached, clipboard in hand. "Mrs. Brooks, I need to get some information about the babies." She sat down in the chair next to Isabel, her name tag reading Sarah. "It's the strangest thing. They haven't cried once since you brought them in. Most newborns would be screaming their heads off by now." Isabel looked down at the sleeping infants. The boy's tiny hand was curled around his sister's arm, as if protecting her even in sleep. "They've been like this since I found them," she said softly. "Calm as can be." Sarah made some notes, her pen scratching against paper. "No birth records that we can find. No trauma, thank goodness. They're healthy. Perfect vital signs. Good color." She shook her head in wonder. "It's like they just appeared." The automatic doors whooshed open, and Sheriff Tom Harlan strode in, his boots squeaking against the polished floor. His face was etched with lines of suspicion as he approached, Isabel, badge glinting under the harsh lights. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, pulling up a chair. "Mind telling me exactly what happened tonight?" His tone was professional, but held an edge of skepticism that made Isabel's spine stiffen. She recounted the events carefully, the choir practice, the drive home, the strange prompting to stop. As she spoke, the female twin stirred slightly, making a soft, cooing sound that seemed to soften even the sheriff's stern expression. "And you'd never met Jordan Mercer before tonight?" Harlan pressed, his pen poised over his notepad. "No, never. But he knew my name," Isabel replied, remembering the strange moment under the overpass. "He said he heard me play piano on the prison chapel radio." Harlan's eyebrows drew together. "Eastgate Prison does broadcast their chapel services," he admitted reluctantly. "But these babies, you understand how impossible his story sounds? Born during a riot that didn't happen?" Before Isabel could respond, a social worker from Child Protective Services arrived, introducing herself as Monica Webster. She was a tall woman with graying hair and tired eyes that had seen too much. "Standard procedure," she explained, though her voice was gentle. "We'll need to place the infants in temporary custody while we sort this out." Isabel felt her heart constrict. "They're so young," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Surely they need consistency right now. Monica's expression softened as she watched the twins sleeping. They do seem remarkably settled with you, she observed. Tell you what, let me make some calls. Maybe we can work something out temporarily. At 11:30, a doctor appeared in the waiting room. Mrs. Brooks, Mr. Mercer is asking for you. He's not stable yet, but he's conscious and insistent about speaking with you. 5 minutes, no more. Isabel carefully transferred the twins to Sarah's waiting arms and followed the doctor down the sterile hallway. Jordan lay in the ICU, surrounded by beeping machines and hanging IV bags. Despite his massive frame, he looked vulnerable against the white hospital sheets. "Isabel?" he whispered as she approached. His voice was weak but clear. "Thank you for stopping. Most people, they just drive by." She took his hand, surprised by how natural it felt. "You said you heard me play?" A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Every Sunday. Your music, it was like a lifeline. When things got dark in there, I'd remember the way you played Amazing Grace. Made me believe change was possible." Tears pricked at Isabel's eyes. For years, she'd wondered if her music still mattered, if God still had use for a widow's offering of piano notes and faith. Now here was this man, telling her that her simple act of service had helped keep hope alive in prison. The monitors began beeping more urgently. Jordan's grip on her hand weakened. "The twins," he said, his voice growing fainter. "They're special, not like other babies. They need... A nurse appeared at Isabel's elbow. "You'll have to leave now," she said firmly, already checking Jordan's vital signs. In the hallway, the hospital's main clock began to strike midnight, its deep tones echoing through the quiet corridors. Isabel hurried back to the waiting area, where the twins still slept peacefully in Sarah's arms. Their faces were turned toward each other, utterly serene despite everything. The final bell toll faded away as Sarah handed the babies back to Isabel. "His condition is getting worse," she said quietly. "The internal bleeding. They're doing everything they can." Isabel sat down heavily in the hard plastic chair, cradling the twins close. Outside the windows, rain continued to fall, drumming a gentle rhythm against the glass. In her arms, the babies slept on, their presence both a comfort and a mystery. She found herself humming Amazing Grace softly, the same arrangement she'd played countless times in the church sanctuary, never knowing who might be listening, never guessing how far those notes might travel, or what miracles they might set in motion. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly in the hospital corridor as Isabel dozed in an uncomfortable chair outside Jordan's room. The twins slept peacefully in her arms, their tiny faces illuminated by the harsh overhead lighting. At 2:15 in the morning, a nurse gently touched her shoulder. "Mrs. Brooks, Mr. Mercer is asking for you. He's more alert now and he's quite insistent about speaking with you alone." Isabel carefully transferred the sleeping infants to the nurse's capable hands and entered Jordan's room. The massive man looked smaller somehow, dwarfed by medical equipment and tangled in tubes and wires. His eyes, though, were clear and focused. "Isabel," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, sit with me. There are things you need to know." She pulled a chair close to his bedside, noting how his breathing seemed more labored than before. "I'm here, Jordan. I need to tell you everything," he began, each word measured and deliberate. "About who I was, who I am now, and these babies." In the dim light, Jordan's face showed years of hard living, but also something else, a profound weariness mixed with urgent purpose. "I was a violent man," he confessed. "Did terrible things. Armed robbery, assault, I hurt people. Deserved every year they gave me at Eastgate. Isabel sat quietly, letting him speak at his own pace. Outside, pre-dawn traffic hummed faintly on the streets below. 3 years ago, during a chapel service, something changed. Your music was playing over the radio system, that hymn about grace, and for the first time, I really heard the words, really felt them. His voice cracked slightly. Started going to Bible study, started changing. The other inmates called me Bear because I got quieter, less aggressive, more protective of the weak ones. He paused, gathering strength. Then yesterday, everything went wrong. A riot broke out in the women's wing. Pure chaos. I was on maintenance duty when I heard screaming from the infirmary. Jordan's eyes grew distant with the memory. There was this woman, Sarah Mitchell, 8 months pregnant, doing time for drug possession. She went into labor during the riot. Isabel leaned forward, her heart aching as the story unfolded. The medical staff had evacuated. She was alone, terrified. I helped her deliver the twins. But there were complications. She knew she was dying. Tears rolled down Jordan's weathered cheeks. Her last words were begging me to save her babies, to keep them safe and find them a good home, not let them end up in the system like she did. The monitor's steady beeping filled the silence between his words. I wrapped them in my work shirt, managed to slip out during the confusion. But I took a bullet getting over the fence. Knew I couldn't keep them. Wasn't meant to. Just had to protect them long enough to find the right person. Jordan's eyes fixed on Isabel with surprising intensity. When I heard your music in prison, I could feel the love and faith in every note. I prayed for months, asking God to show me what real goodness looked like. Then tonight, there you were, stopping when no one else would. With trembling hands, he reached for a crumpled paper on his bedside table. I wrote this, my last act as their temporary guardian, naming you to take my place. His breathing grew more labored as he pressed the handwritten note into her hands. Jordan, Isabel whispered, overwhelmed by the weight of what he was asking. I'm 63 years old. A widow. How can I… You already love them, he interrupted gently. I saw it the moment you held them. They need someone who'll love them like that. Someone who'll teach them about grace. Suddenly, the monitors began shrieking. Jordan's eyes widened, his hand clutching his chest. Promise me, he gasped. Promise you'll keep them safe. I promise, Isabel said firmly, gripping his hand as medical staff rushed in. The next few minutes passed in a blur of activity and urgent voices. Despite the doctor's best efforts, Jordan Bear Mercer slipped away just as the first hint of dawn appeared through the window. The time of death was recorded as 5:47 in the morning. Isabel stood in the doorway, the handwritten note clutched in her hand, watching as they covered Jordan's body. She felt the loss deeply. This man she'd known for mere hours had entrusted her with something precious, something that would change her life forever. At 6 o'clock sharp, Monica Webster from Child Protective Services appeared with paperwork in hand. She looked exhausted but kind as she reviewed Jordan's note and Isabel's information. Given the unusual circumstances and Mr. Mercer's explicit wishes, we'll grant you temporary guardianship pending a full investigation, Monica explained. We'll need to conduct home visits, background checks, standard procedure. But for now, the twins will remain in your care. Isabel nodded, still trying to process everything that had happened since choir practice just hours ago. Sarah, the church secretary, arrived with 2 car seats borrowed from the nursery, helping Isabel secure them properly in her sedan. As the sun broke over the horizon, Isabel walked out of the hospital carrying the twins, one in each arm. They stirred slightly in the morning light, but remained remarkably peaceful. The boy's tiny hand gripped her finger as she settled them into their car seats. Standing in the hospital parking lot, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold, Isabel felt the full weight of her new reality. She was no longer just a witness to this miracle. She was now its caretaker. At 63, when she thought her life was settling into a quiet routine, God had handed her 2 precious lives to protect and nurture. The twins slept soundly as she started the car, their small faces serene despite all they'd been through. Isabel took a deep breath, adjusting her rear-view mirror to keep them in sight. The future stretched before her, full of uncertainty and challenge, but also possibility and purpose. The morning sun cast gentle shadows through Isabel's living room windows as she carried the twins through her front door for the first time. Her modest 3-bedroom home, usually so quiet and orderly, suddenly felt both too empty and too small for the task ahead. The silence that had been her constant companion for years was now broken by soft coos and tiny breaths. "Lord, help me remember how to do this," she whispered, carefully setting the car seats down. Her hands trembled slightly as she unbuckled the first baby, the girl, and cradled her close. The infant's dark eyes seemed to study her face with an intensity that made Isabel's heart catch. The practical challenges hit her all at once. She had no diapers, no formula, no clothes beyond the hospital blankets. The last time she'd cared for a baby was 35 years ago, with her own son, James. That familiar ache squeezed her chest, but she pushed it aside. These little ones needed her now. Just as panic started to rise, her doorbell chimed. Pastor Elaine Carter stood on the porch, her arms laden with shopping bags. "I figured you might need a few things," Elaine said warmly, stepping inside. She began unpacking supplies: diapers, wipes, formula, bottles, onesies in soft yellow and green. "The church ladies are organizing more, but this should get you started." Isabel felt tears welling up. "Elaine, I don't know the first thing about caring for twins. What was I thinking, agreeing to this?" The pastor set down a package of diapers and gripped Isabel's free hand. "You were thinking with your heart, which is exactly what God needed you to do. Now then, shall we figure out these bottle instructions together?" For the next hour, Elaine helped Isabel establish a feeding routine. The twins took to the formula easily, their tiny hands curling against the bottles. Between feedings, they tackled diaper changes, an adventure that left both women laughing despite their uncertainty. "They're so calm," Elaine marveled, rocking the boy while Isabel burped his sister. "Most newborns I've known cry constantly, but these two, there's something special about them." Isabel nodded, remembering Jordan's words about their miraculous birth. "Do you think I'm crazy, taking this on at my age?" "I think you're exactly who these babies need," Elaine replied. She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Isabel, I've watched you carry your grief with such quiet dignity these past years. Maybe God isn't just using you to help these twins. Maybe He's using them to help you too." Before Isabel could respond, another knock came at the door. Margaret Chen from next door stood there with a homemade casserole. "I thought you might need dinner," she said shyly. They had barely spoken in the 5 years they'd been neighbors. Throughout the afternoon, more visitors arrived. Sarah from church brought a portable crib. The Williams family dropped off bags of baby clothes their youngest had outgrown. Even Mrs. Patterson, who had stopped attending church 3 years ago after a bitter argument with the previous pastor, came by with armfuls of supplies. "I've been holding on to too much anger," Mrs. Patterson admitted, watching the twins sleep. "Life's too short for that foolishness. These babies, they remind me what really matters." As the sun began to sink, Isabel found herself alone with the twins for the first time since the hospital. They lay sleeping in their borrowed crib, peaceful despite the day's constant stream of visitors. The house felt different somehow, warmer, fuller with their presence. She moved to her piano, dusty from disuse. Her fingers hovered over the keys hesitantly. Since losing James, music had been more painful than comforting. But now, watching the steady rise and fall of the twins' breathing, she felt drawn to play. The first notes were tentative, a simple hymn she'd played thousands of times. As the melody filled the room, memories flooded back, playing lullabies for James, accompanying church services with her husband beside her, the joy music had once brought to her life. The twins stirred slightly but didn't wake, almost as if the music soothed them. Isabel played softly until twilight painted her living room in deep purples and blues. Her back ached from the unfamiliar work of lifting babies, and her eyes felt heavy with exhaustion. Yet beneath the physical tiredness, something else stirred, a sense of rightness she hadn't felt in years. Looking around her transformed living room, now cluttered with baby supplies and evidence of her community's kindness, Isabel realized her quiet, ordered life had been upended in the space of 24 hours. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt a growing certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. The twins would need feeding again soon. There would be more diapers to change, more adjustments to make. But for now, Isabel sat in the gathering darkness, listening to their gentle breathing and the lingering echoes of piano notes in the air. For the first time in years, her home felt truly alive. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot as Isabel pulled into a visitor's space. She sat for a moment, gathering her strength. The twins were safe with Pastor Elaine, but leaving them, even briefly, had been harder than expected. Inside, the hospital corridors felt different in daylight. Last night's urgency had faded to a heavy quiet. At the nurse's station, a stern-faced woman directed Isabel to the administrative office, where Jordan's belongings were being held. "Not much to collect," the clerk said, sliding a plastic bag across the counter. "Wallet, keys, and a few personal items." Isabel's hands trembled as she opened the bag. Inside, she found a well-worn Bible with passages underlined in shaky pencil, a photo of a younger Jordan in his biker vest, and a silver chain with a simple cross pendant. "Mrs. Brooks." Sheriff Harlan's voice made her turn. He stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Got a minute?" They moved to a quiet consultation room, where the sheriff spread several files on the table. "Jordan Mercer's record," he explained, his tone carefully neutral. "Armed robbery, assault, gang affiliations, served 15 years before his release last month." Isabel studied the mugshots, a younger, harder version of the gentleman who'd entrusted her with the twins. "People can change, Sheriff." "Maybe so." He leaned forward. "But CPS will look at this history. They'll question his judgment in naming you guardian. These babies could have relatives somewhere, people with legal rights. He said their mother died in the riot, that she asked him to protect them. A story we can't verify." Harlan's fingers drummed the table. "Look, I know you mean well, but this situation, it's complicated." Before Isabel could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway. A nurse had dropped a tray, medical supplies scattered across the floor. But what caught Isabel's attention was the baby, one of the twins, being carried by another nurse for routine checks. The stern-faced nurse from earlier rushed to help clean up, but froze when the baby reached toward her. Something in her hard expression cracked as she took the infant. "Oh," she whispered, tears suddenly streaming down her face. "Oh my." Isabel watched in amazement as the nurse sank into a chair, still cradling the baby. "I haven't held a little one since my Sarah." Her voice broke. "Haven't spoken to her in 8 years, my own daughter, and I let pride keep us apart." The baby cooed softly, and the nurse's tears flowed faster. "I need to call her. Today, before I lose any more time." Sheriff Harlan watched the scene with obvious discomfort. Isabel touched his arm gently. "I've seen this before. Something about these twins. They bring out truth in people, help them face what they've been avoiding." "That's a pretty convenient miracle," he muttered, but his skepticism seemed forced. By late afternoon, Isabel was home preparing for the CPS visit. She'd spent hours organizing supplies, reviewing safety measures, and praying continuously. The twins slept peacefully in their borrowed crib while she straightened already neat rooms. The doorbell rang at exactly 4 o'clock. 2 CPS workers introduced themselves: Mrs. Chen, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, and Mr. Peterson, whose clipboard seemed permanently attached to his hand. "We need to be thorough," Mrs. Chen explained as they began their inspection. "The circumstances are unusual, to say the least." They checked everything: kitchen cabinets, electrical outlets, sleeping arrangements. Mr. Peterson made copious notes, while Mrs. Chen asked careful questions about Isabel's support system and financial stability. "Your home is lovely," Mrs. Chen said finally, "but we have concerns about placement with a single woman of your age. And there's the matter of Jordan Mercer's criminal history." As if on cue, one of the twins began to fuss. Isabel lifted the baby girl, who immediately settled. Mr. Peterson stepped closer, his professional detachment wavering as the infant caught his gaze. "Would you like to hold her?" Isabel offered. He hesitated, then set down his clipboard. The moment the baby settled in his arms, his stern expression softened. "My wife and I," he started, then swallowed hard. "We've been trying for 5 years, 2 miscarriages. I've been so angry at God, but holding this little one." Mrs. Chen touched his shoulder gently. "We'll continue our investigation, of course," she told Isabel, "but for now, the twins appear to be in good hands." After they left, Isabel sat in her rocking chair, emotionally drained. The twins slept on, unaware of the day's tensions. In the quiet, she bowed her head. "Lord," she whispered, "I'm not asking for miracles. Just show me the way forward. Help me understand what you're doing here." A soft breeze stirred the curtains. Outside, a mourning dove called, its gentle song carrying on the evening air. Isabel kept rocking, kept praying, as darkness gathered and stars began to appear. She thought of Jordan's last hours, of the nurse's tears, of Mr. Peterson's confession. Something extraordinary was happening through these babies, not flashy miracles, but quiet transformations of the heart. The weight of responsibility still felt enormous, but underneath it ran a current of certainty. Whatever came next, she wasn't facing it alone. Friday morning arrived with a soft drizzle that matched Isabel's unsettled spirit. She had just finished feeding the twins when her phone rang. The caller ID showed Ridgeway General Hospital. "Mrs. Brooks, this is Dr. Martinez from the pediatric unit. We need to schedule DNA testing for the twins today. It's standard procedure in cases like this. We have to identify any possible biological relatives." Isabel's hand tightened on the phone. "I understand. What time would you like us to come in? Could you bring them at 10 o'clock? The lab technician has a clear schedule then." After hanging up, Isabel gazed at the babies sleeping peacefully in their borrowed crib. The boy's tiny hand clutched his sister's blanket, as if even in sleep they needed to stay connected. She touched each downy head gently, whispering a prayer. The hospital's fluorescent lights felt harsh after the gentle morning rain. As Isabel wheeled the twins in their double stroller toward the lab, a commotion near the security desk caught her attention. A man in an orange jumpsuit, accompanied by 2 guards, was being escorted through the hallway. She recognized the Department of Corrections logo on the guards' uniforms. The inmate stopped abruptly when he saw the babies. "Those them?" he asked hoarsely. "The miracle twins from the riot?" One guard moved to push him along, but the man's eyes were fixed on the infants. "Please," he said, "just let me see them for a minute. I was there that night." The guards exchanged glances, then nodded. Under their watchful eyes, the inmate knelt beside the stroller. The twins looked back at him with their unnaturally calm gazes. Tears began rolling down the man's weathered face. "I did something terrible," he whispered. 8 years ago, armed robbery in Memphis. Shot a man. They never proved it was me, but—" His shoulders shook. "I can't carry it anymore. Looking at these little ones, it's like God himself is staring right through me." One of the guards radioed for assistance, while the other took notes on the man's spontaneous confession. Isabel stood quietly, witnessing another moment of transformation. Later that morning, after the DNA swabs were collected, Isabel drove to church for a meeting with Pastor Elaine. In the parking lot, she noticed Thomas and Sarah Miller sitting in their car, talking intently. The couple had been separated for months, their marriage strained to breaking. As Isabel passed their car, Sarah stepped out. "Isabel, wait! Could we see the twins?" Thomas joined his wife, keeping a careful distance. Isabel invited them inside, where the babies were just waking from their nap. Sarah lifted the little girl while Thomas held the boy. The couple stood close together, almost touching. "Remember when our Katie was this tiny?" Sarah's voice trembled. Thomas nodded, his throat working. "I've been such a fool, Sarah, putting work before everything, before you. I haven't been fair either." Sarah moved closer to her husband. "Maybe we could try counseling again?" By early afternoon, Isabel sat across from Sheriff Harlan in his office, discussing the DNA testing. But something was different about him today. His usual confident manner seemed strained. "Mrs. Brooks," he began, then stopped. Started again. "Isabel, there's something you need to know about Jordan Mercer." She waited as he struggled visibly with his words. 15 years ago, there was an incident. 2 of our prominent families, the Ridgeways, both branches had been feuding for generations. Their kids got into some trouble, serious trouble. Jordan was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Harlan's face had grown pale. "I was a young deputy then, ambitious. When the families pressured the department, I let Jordan take the fall. First offense on his record." The confession hung heavy in the air. Isabel thought of Jordan's gentle strength, his determination to protect the twins. Did he know? He knew. Never said a word about it. Went to prison, found God there. Harlan's hands were shaking. "These babies, they're connected to the Ridgeways somehow. I can feel it. And now the truth's coming out everywhere I look." The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and visits. By nightfall, Isabel sat in her living room, watching the twins sleep while her mind churned with all she'd witnessed. The inmate's confession, the Millers' reconciliation, Harlan's guilty admission. She thought of how Jordan had carried these babies through rain and pain, knowing somehow they needed to reach her, how people changed just by being in their presence. Truth was awakening across Ridgeway, spreading like ripples in a pond. The weight of it pressed down, not just the responsibility of caring for 2 infants, but the larger purpose unfolding. Isabel played a soft hymn on the piano, her fingers finding the familiar keys in the gathering darkness. She couldn't control what was happening, couldn't direct where all these revealed truths might lead. But as the twins slept on peacefully, she sensed that was never her role. She was simply meant to witness, to support, to provide safe harbor while God's plan unveiled itself in His own time and way. Outside her window, the Friday night traffic hummed along Route 19. Somewhere in that darkness, more secrets waited to surface, more hearts prepared to crack open. Isabel closed the piano quietly and settled into her rocking chair for another night of watching over her unexpected charges. Truth, once awakened, would find its own path. Her job was simply to be ready when it did. The morning sun cast long shadows across Isabel's kitchen as she prepared her second cup of coffee. The twins were sleeping peacefully in their borrowed bassinets, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect rhythm. The quiet morning felt deceptively normal, but Isabel's heart raced every time the phone rang. At 9:15, it finally happened. The call came from Sheriff Harlan. "Mrs. Brooks, the DNA results are in." His voice was tight, professional. "Could you come down to the station? There's something we need to discuss." Isabel's hands trembled as she arranged for her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, to watch. The twins. The drive to the police station seemed both too long and too short. Each traffic light gave her time to pray, to steady her nerves. Sheriff Harlan was waiting outside his office with two men in suits, one from Child Protective Services and another she didn't recognize. Their faces were grim. "Please, sit down." Harlan gestured to a chair. He cleared his throat. "The DNA results show something unexpected. The twins are related to both the Eastridge Caldwells and the West Side Caldwells." Isabel's mind spun. The Caldwell families had been Ridgeway's most prominent and most divided citizens for generations. Their feud was legendary, marked by lawsuits, property disputes, and whispered scandals that went back decades. "It appears," the unknown man spoke up, introducing himself as James Morton, the Caldwell family attorney, that the twins' mother was Rebecca Caldwell from the East Ridge branch. She'd been disowned years ago. The father... He paused, consulting his notes. "DNA confirms it was Michael Caldwell from the West Side family." The revelation hit Isabel like a physical blow. No wonder Jordan had been so protective, so determined to keep the babies away from the system. They were living proof of a connection between two families who'd spent generations denying any relationship to each other. "This complicates things significantly," the CPS worker, Mr. Reynolds, stated flatly. "Both families are already filing custody claims. Given the high-profile nature of the situation, we'll need to reevaluate the current placement immediately." "But the twins are doing well," Isabel protested, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're settled. Calm." "Mrs. Brooks," Mr. Reynolds said, not unkindly, "you were always meant to be a temporary solution. These children have blood relatives with significant resources and legal rights." The morning dissolved into a blur of paperwork and raised voices. Both Caldwell families arrived at the station within hours, their attorneys filling the small space with legal terms and barely concealed hostility. Margaret Caldwell from East Ridge, Rebecca's mother, couldn't even look at the West Side family members. "Those children belong with their mother's family," she insisted, her voice sharp with decades of bitterness. "They carry our name too," Robert Caldwell from the West Side countered. "Michael was my nephew, whatever mistakes he made." Isabel sat quietly, watching the families argue over children they hadn't even met, while Jordan's final words echoed in her mind. They need someone who sees them as more than blood and birthrights. By late afternoon, the tension had reached a breaking point. Mr. Reynolds pulled Isabel aside. "We'll need to place the twins in neutral territory while this is sorted out," he explained. "A licensed foster home temporarily, just until the court can evaluate everyone's claims." He handed her a paper. Please have them ready by 7 o'clock this evening. Isabel drove home in a daze, her vision blurring with unshed tears. The twins were awake when she arrived, their dark eyes following her as she moved around the house. "I'm so sorry, little ones," she whispered, carefully folding tiny sleepers into a borrowed diaper bag. Each item she packed felt like another piece of her heart breaking away. The soft blanket they loved, the stuffed lamb someone from church had brought, the matching pacifiers still in their package. The house grew darker as evening approached. Isabel sat in her rocking chair, holding both babies close. They remained unusually calm, as if they understood something she couldn't. She hummed old hymns, trying to memorize the weight of them in her arms. At 7 o'clock sharp, Mr. Reynolds arrived with a foster care worker. The exchange was brief, professional. Isabel's hands shook as she buckled them into their car seats one last time. "You've done a wonderful job," Mr. Reynolds assured her. "Sometimes the hardest part of fostering is letting go." But this wasn't supposed to be fostering, Isabel thought. This was supposed to be… what? A miracle? A second chance? She watched the car drive away until its taillights disappeared around the corner. The silence in her house was deafening. Isabel moved through the rooms like a ghost, straightening things that didn't need straightening, unable to look at the empty bassinets. Just before midnight, she sat at her piano, fingers hovering over the keys. But no music came. The instrument that had always been her comfort, her connection to God's presence, felt cold and foreign under her hands. She closed the piano lid slowly, the soft thud echoing in the empty room. How foolish she'd been to think God had chosen her for something special. She was just a widow with a piano and an empty house, who'd briefly been allowed to hold a miracle before it slipped away. Isabel turned off the lights and sat in the darkness, her faith as quiet as the house around her. The clock struck midnight, each chime another reminder of her solitude. She had misunderstood everything: God's calling, her purpose, the meaning of those few precious days. The silence stretched on, unbroken even by her prayers. Sunday morning dawned with heavy clouds hanging low over Ridgeway, matching Isabel's heart as she prepared for church. The twins' borrowed clothes and supplies had been returned yesterday, leaving only empty spaces where their presence had briefly filled her home. But Pastor Elaine had called late last night, insisting that Isabel bring them to service one last time. "The congregation needs to see them," she'd said firmly. "God isn't finished yet." So here Isabel was, pulling into the church parking lot at 8:45 in the morning, her hands tight on the steering wheel. Mr. Reynolds from CPS had reluctantly agreed to bring the twins, following her in a separate car. The social worker looked uncomfortable in his Sunday suit as he helped transfer the car seats. 1 hour, he reminded her. Then they need to go back to the foster home. Isabel nodded, unable to trust her voice. The twins were peaceful as always, their dark eyes alert despite the early hour. She carried them carefully up the church steps, trying not to think about how this might be the last time. The sanctuary was already filling up, buzzing with whispered conversations that died down as she entered. News had spread quickly about the DNA results and the custody battle brewing between the Caldwell families. Isabel kept her eyes forward as she made her way to her usual pew, conscious of the stares following her. To her surprise, both Caldwell families were present, though seated as far apart as the sanctuary allowed. The Eastridge Caldwells occupied the front right pew, backs rigid with carefully maintained dignity. The West Side branch had claimed territory in the back left corner, their attorney conspicuously present. Sheriff Harlan slipped in just before the service began, looking unusually disheveled. He chose a seat near the middle, alone. Pastor Elaine took the pulpit at 9 o'clock sharp, her silver hair gleaming under the lights. She opened her Bible with familiar grace, but something in her expression seemed different, more intense, almost expectant. Our text today, she began, comes from 1 John chapter 1, verse 9. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. She paused, looking out over the congregation with unexpected weight in her gaze. I had a different sermon prepared for today, but as I prayed this morning, God made it clear he has other plans. The twins stirred in Isabel's arms, making soft sounds that seemed to emphasize the pastor's words. Several heads turned toward them. We've witnessed something extraordinary this week, Pastor Elaine continued. 2 precious lives, delivered through sacrifice and violence, yet carrying peace wherever they go. We've seen hardened hearts soften in their presence. We've watched old wounds begin to heal. But God is showing me that we've only scratched the surface of what needs to happen in this community. She gripped the pulpit edges, visibly struggling with emotion. I need to start. For 30 years, I've known about financial misconduct in our building fund. I helped cover it up to protect the church's reputation. The money was paid back, but the deception remained. I am sorry. God, forgive me. A shocked murmur rippled through the sanctuary. Pastor Elaine had never lost composure like this before. The silence that followed felt electric. Then Sheriff Harlan stood up, his face ashen. I need to speak, he said, his voice rough. What happened to Jordan Mercer wasn't right. 8 years ago, I helped frame him for a crime he didn't commit. The real guilty parties were protected because of their names, their money. I took bribes to keep quiet. His hands were shaking. Jordan went to prison, innocent. But he came out changed, really changed, and his last act was saving those babies, while I'm still hiding behind my badge. The twins remained perfectly still as the sheriff's confession echoed through the sanctuary. Isabel felt tears sliding down her cheeks. More movement. Margaret Caldwell rising slowly from her seat, her perfect posture crumbling. Michael was my grandson, she said, her voice breaking. When he got Rebecca pregnant, we paid to have her sent away. Said she was lying about the baby being his. We knew it was true, but we couldn't bear the scandal of him being involved with one of them. She gestured vaguely toward the West Side Caldwells. We're just as guilty, Robert Caldwell called out from the back. We disowned Michael's mother, my sister, when she married into the East Ridge family. Cut her off completely. Michael grew up never knowing his father's side of the family. Maybe if we hadn't been so proud. One by one, voices rose throughout the sanctuary. Years of buried resentments, hidden sins, and unspoken regrets poured out. Old arguments were aired and acknowledged. Tears flowed freely as people began moving across the aisle, reaching for hands they'd refused to shake for decades. The twins watched it all with their unnaturally calm gazes. When Margaret Caldwell finally approached her West Side relatives, one of the babies made a soft cooing sound that seemed to break the last barrier. Both families gathered around Isabel's pew, their years of hatred dissolving as they looked at the infants who carried both their bloodlines. Mr. Reynolds stood near the back, his official clipboard hanging forgotten at his side. Isabel saw him wiping his eyes more than once as reconciliation continued to spread through the congregation. Pastor Elaine never finished her sermon. She didn't need to. God's message was being delivered more powerfully through broken confessions and healing embraces than any prepared words could have managed. As the morning stretched on, Isabel held the twins and watched truth transform her church family. Her own tears had dried, replaced by a sense of awe at how God had used 2 tiny lives to break down walls that had seemed permanent just days ago. The CPS officials who had come to supervise remained in their places, silent witnesses to something that went far beyond custody arrangements and legal claims. The twins had accomplished more in their first week of life than most people managed in years, not through any action of their own, but simply by being living proof that love was stronger than division. The afternoon sun streamed through the stained glass windows as Mr. Reynolds from Child Protective Services sat at a table in the church office, methodically reviewing statements and testimonies. Dr. Sarah Chen from Ridgeway General spoke first, her voice steady and professional. In my 15 years of pediatric care, I've never seen newborns quite like these two, she explained. They're remarkably healthy despite their unusual circumstances, but what stands out most is how they respond to Mrs. Brooks. The twins show all the signs of secure attachment we look for: consistent feeding, steady weight gain, appropriate sleep patterns. Nurse Martinez added her observations about the healing influence the babies seemed to have on the hospital ward. People who held them just changed, started talking about making things right in their lives. Pastor Elaine's testimony carried particular weight. Isabel Brooks has been our church pianist for 23 years. Her faith isn't showy, but it's genuine. I've watched her maintain her grace through losing both her husband and son. These twins have brought something back to life in her, and in our whole community. Sheriff Harlan's statement proved especially compelling. He spoke about Jordan Mercer's final hours and his own transformation. Those babies helped bring truth to light that needed telling, and Mrs. Brooks, she's been the steady center of it all, never wavered, even when things got hard. Throughout the afternoon, person after person came forward. Church members described Isabel's gentle strength. Neighbors told stories of her quiet kindness. Even the rival families, who had been bitter enemies just days ago, now sat together in unprecedented unity. Margaret Caldwell spoke for both branches of the family. "We've spent generations fighting over property lines and old grudges," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "These babies, they're not property to be claimed. They're a gift meant to heal something broken in all of us. Isabel Brooks is the right person to raise them. She'll make sure they know both sides of their family story, without the poison of our pride." Robert Caldwell nodded in agreement. "We don't want custody. We want to be grandparents who support their guardian, Mrs. Brooks. She's earned that role, fair and square." Mr. Reynolds listened carefully, taking detailed notes. He consulted with his colleagues, reviewed financial statements, and examined Isabel's home study results. By 5 o'clock, he stood up and cleared his throat. Based on the overwhelming evidence of Mrs. Brooks's fitness as a guardian, the extraordinary circumstances of this case, and the unified support of the biological families involved, Child Protective Services is prepared to grant permanent guardianship to Isabel Brooks, effective immediately. The news spread quickly. People began gathering on the church lawn, bringing casseroles and baby supplies. Someone set up folding chairs. Children played tag between the adults' legs, while their parents shared stories about the week's events. Isabel sat on the church steps, one twin in each arm, watching the impromptu celebration. The setting sun painted everything in warm, golden light. After holding herself together through days of uncertainty, something finally broke loose inside her. Tears spilled down her cheeks, not the anxious tears of earlier days, but cleansing tears of release. Pastor Elaine sat down beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I was so afraid," Isabel whispered, her voice trembling. "Afraid to hope, afraid to love them too much, afraid I'd misunderstood what God was asking of me." "Look at all of this," Pastor Elaine gestured to the gathering. "Sometimes God's plans are bigger than our fears." The babies stirred, making their soft cooing sounds that had become familiar to Isabel over the past days. The girl opened her eyes, gazing up with that unnaturally calm expression. Her brother yawned and nestled closer. Margaret Caldwell approached, holding a handmade quilt. "This was meant for my grandson," she said softly. "I think it belongs to these little ones now." She draped it carefully over the twins, her hands lingering for a moment on their tiny feet. Isabel felt the weight of the moment, not just the responsibility she was accepting, but the healing she had witnessed. In less than a week, these two small lives had helped mend decades of hurt. Now she would have the privilege of raising them, supported by a community that had learned the power of truth and forgiveness. She wiped her eyes and hugged the twins closer, their warm weight anchoring her to this new reality. The tears continued to flow freely, washing away the last of her doubt and fear. The weeks flowed together like gentle streams after a spring rain. March gave way to April, and the twins grew stronger each day. Their tiny fingers now gripped Isabel's with surprising strength, and their peaceful gazes continued to touch hearts throughout Ridgeway. Isabel found herself embracing motherhood with a grace that surprised even her. The sleepless nights and constant demands felt less like burdens and more like blessings. Church members organized a meal rotation, ensuring she had home-cooked dinners. Neighbors stopped by with diapers and formula, staying to rock babies while Isabel caught quick naps. Sheriff Tom Harlan made good on his promise of change. In a move that stunned the town, he submitted his resignation to the county board. "It's time for fresh leadership," he announced at his final press conference. "I'm starting a fund to help families affected by my past mistakes. It won't fix everything, but it's a start." The transformation of the rival families became the talk of Ridgeway. The Caldwells and Hendersons, who hadn't broken bread together since 1978, now shared Sunday dinners. Their grandchildren played together on the same lawns where "no trespassing" signs once stood. "Funny how it took these little ones to remind us we're all connected," Margaret Caldwell remarked one afternoon, watching the twins sleep in their bassinet. Isabel's return to the church piano marked another healing. Her fingers found the keys with renewed purpose, and the congregation noticed the difference. Where duty once guided her playing, joy now led the way. The twins stayed quiet during services, as if listening to their mother's music. At the Maytown Council meeting, Mayor Thompson called for attention. The room was packed, unusual for a routine gathering. "We're here to vote on renaming Route 19, he announced. "The proposal before us is to designate it as Mercy Way in recognition of Jordan Mercer's final act of sacrifice." The vote was unanimous. Isabel sat in the back, holding the twins, watching democracy and redemption unfold together. The new street signs would go up next week, a permanent reminder that grace could transform even the darkest roads into pathways of light. The late June sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of Ridgeway Community Church, painting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden floor. Isabel Brooks sat at the piano, her fingers hovering over the keys as the morning light warmed her shoulders. The sanctuary smelled of fresh flowers and lemon polish, just as it had every Sunday for the past 40 years. In the front pew, the twins sat contentedly in their matching church outfits, gifts from both the Caldwell and Henderson families. At 6 months old, they were picture-perfect, with bright eyes and chubby cheeks. Mrs. Henderson gently bounced the little girl on her knee, while Mr. Caldwell held the boy, their former animosity replaced by shared joy in these unexpected grandchildren. The congregation settled into their seats, but this wasn't the same group that had gathered here half a year ago. They sat closer together now, old barriers dissolved. Where empty spaces once marked long-held grudges, people now filled the gaps, shoulders touching, hymn books shared. Isabel's hands found their place above the keys. The hymn was one she'd stopped playing after losing her husband and son. "Great is thy faithfulness." For years, the very thought of it had brought too much pain. But today, something different stirred in her heart. As she began to play, the familiar notes filled the sanctuary. Each chord felt like coming home, like finding an old friend waiting exactly where you'd left them. The twins, usually active, grew still as their mother's music rose to the rafters. They watched her with those unnaturally calm eyes that still had the power to draw truth from the deepest places. The congregation's voices joined in, strong and sure. Isabel felt tears prick at her corners of her eyes, but they weren't tears of sorrow. She thought back to that rainy night on Route 19, now Mercy Way, when she'd almost driven past. She hadn't been looking for a miracle. She'd simply answered a quiet prompting, the kind she'd ignored so many times before. That small act of obedience had rippled outward, touching lives she never expected to reach. The proof sat in these pews, former enemies now family, broken relationships now mended, hidden sins now brought to light and healed. Even her own heart, so carefully guarded for so long, had been transformed. The music swelled around her as Isabel played, her fingers moving with certainty born not of practice but of purpose. She realized now that faith wasn't about having all the answers, or even feeling sure of the path ahead. True faith was simply being willing to take the next step, to say yes when called, even without understanding why. The love she'd carried through her years of loss hadn't diminished. It had multiplied. She saw it reflected in the faces of her church family, in the peaceful expressions of the twins, in the way the morning light seemed to dance across the keys beneath her fingers. Each note she played rang with the truth she'd finally embraced. That love, when carried faithfully through suffering, always found new ways to grow. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.